All of us of a certain age in this congregation have certainly experienced, maybe a long time ago, but for people like me, maybe pretty recently, a profound death of expectations that didn't even occur to us as something that could happen. We all know we're personally going to die, but a death of expectations of how the future is going to unfold. I intend this to be a very practical talk, reflection about some of the things that have absolutely taken my full attention within the last half year. And even before that, 3 years ago, I gave a guest sermon here that was called Worldviews in Transition. So you can see I was already struggling with a death of expectations, and whoa, now even things are crumbling out in front of me of how things are and how things ought to go. So it's continuing in this realm, and what's practical about it is that I have been learning things simply by serving as video editor of a conversation series that my husband, Michael Dowd, and I initiated. There's other people who were involved in co-hosting it, but it's called Post-Doom Conversations. And some of you may be familiar with Skype and Zoom technology, but we've been able to, in the moment, have video coming in from even conversations with people in Australia and the UK that I then edit and put up for free on YouTube. And for me, I use my video editing skills, but I used to be a science writer. I don't have wisdom about spirituality and philosophy and all that. Ask me about trees. Ask me about evolution. So in the course of video editing, I'm able to start taking in some of that wisdom, bringing it into helping me in the collapse of my worldviews. So I'd like to share with you not the essence of some of what these great people, young and old. The youngest we have is about 28 years old. The oldest, Joanna Macy, who's now 90. And so a whole realm of people across generations and in English-speaking places around the world as well. So I'm going to offer 5 patterns that have become apparent to me in just the 13 of these that I've edited thus far. Michael's already got a total of 60 that he's recorded. Takes an hour or two to record. Takes me 3 or 4 days to edit, okay? He'll probably have another 40 that he's already lined up to do. But here are the patterns from these 13 that I've already edited. 5 patterns that are practical for me to keep aware of, and I'm hoping there'll be something in here practical for you. First of all, what we mean by post-doom conversations isn't people who say, oh yeah, we're going to go through a downturn, and then everything will be fine. It'll be doom and then beyond doom. No, it has nothing to do with one's sense of the practical world, of what's going on now and what's likely to go on. The only commonality is people who agree that looking into the future is not this, but we're looking into this. And some of those people, it's looking a little into this, and others, it's there, okay? And so it ranges from something seriously going wrong with how we live here in the United States to death of the American empire, global economic collapse, civilizational disruption, and then some rather near-term loss of significant numbers of people, even possibly human extinction, along with the 6th great mass extinction we're in. So there's this whole sense of what goes on. But what's interesting to me is the first pattern I've seen in these discussions, very vulnerable discussions. I feel like a fly on the wall, watching Michael bring out the stories and the vulnerability of these people who are teachers, and yet they reveal their own grayness, their own difficulties, their stories. And so the first thing that I noticed is that it's beyond arguing, is climate change real? How far is the economic collapse going to go? None of that. It's not about the facts of the outer world that we're trying to accommodate and adapt to. It's all about the inner. How do we be with this? Who do we be with this as the world unfolds? And so I find that there's an enormous agreement on the importance of speaking to these concepts and looking for wisdom along the way. The one exception where there's disagreement, and this is very practical for all of us here, anyone who's engaged in activism that's not person-to-person compassion, personal service, but has something to do with trying to work for systemic change at any level, there's a deep sense of fear that if people speak too much about very reduced expectations, people who hear them will go, oh, well, nothing we can do. I'm not doing anything. Party down, or I'll just be a good person. What they all agree on, though, is the importance of local action. Sometimes as local as the soil in your own backyard, building soil. So that is something that's very important, and I don't know how they work through it all the time. Michael has talked with two people in the UK who one was an originator of, and one is one of the first people arrested as part of the Extinction Rebellion. And of course, both of them are working for systemic change. And so they both specified it. Joanna Macy as well, obviously with her nuclear work. Last thing she wants is to have something go wrong with the economy such that we got Fukushimas happening in every power-generating nuclear plant around the world. So of course, she's concerned. There's a balance that she serves. So that was the first thing. Diversity of sense of where the future is going. But basically, we're not arguing facts anymore. Where's the wisdom here? How do we live? Second pattern I noticed is virtually every one of them said whatever spiritual tools they have for accommodating the death of expectations in their own life, and there's a variety of them. Finding a peer group. Finding people you can safely talk with and who will listen and maybe mirror back to you some of the things that you're feeling is absolutely essential. I would hazard to say that probably some of us here in this season that's just passed had another experience of how important it is to realize what you can talk about and what you should not talk about when you have family gatherings. Very common. I've felt that myself. Let me quote here Dougald Hine. Some of you may be familiar with the Dark Mountain Project. He's in the UK. Dark Mountain Manifesto. Michael had a conversation with him. It's one of the most recent one I video edited and put up on YouTube. And Dougald Hine said, in the context of how important it is to find a peer group and create safe space, he said, people need to feel safe to share their doubts and their fears and their darknesses and their uncertainties without pressure to put on a face of positivity or to move quickly to action or answers. Troubles talk. You need to be able to do that and not have someone step forward and discount why that's not valuable or try to fix you right away. And so this necessity of a peer group. And one of the things I found most exciting about the 13 conversations I've already edited, 2 young women who are a couple now, but they started as mission partners. And they have developed what they call the Good Grief Network. One of them had experience in adult children of alcoholics and Al-Anon, and the other one just had a very, unfortunately, more common experience of throughout her adolescence, while she was still in school, falling into massive depressions. And so the 2 of them got together and they said, what can we do for helping people take what we've all been given, the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross stages of grief thing, for dealing with personal death, personal grief. What about eco-grief? What about climate grief? This kind of grief. And so they've done that. They have a 10-step program that they call the Good Grief Network that they're experimenting with. And I just found that incredibly inspiring as a way to start creating a peer group. Because you know what they say? When people take one of these steps each week for 10 weeks, and at the end, they don't want to stop getting together. They have been mirrored that they are not alone. There are other people who feel like them. So that's one on there. It's Laura Schmidt and Aimee Lewis-Reau, 2 young women from the United States who have put that together. So the first one, that there's a diversity of views, but no debate. We're together in this. The second one, the importance of finding people to share with, to be vulnerable with, that you can count on, who will listen, and where you don't feel so crazy. Third one is the importance of sharing stories. Sharing stories, and Michael did a really good job in the conversations. I had a lot to do, as did 2 other women, in helping develop the series of questions that would be used here. And one of the things that Michael just does not let people get away with is just abstract concepts. It's a little harder with the scientists and the academic economists, okay? But he is pushing in there. Tell us your story. How did you grow up? What were your expectations? What were the things, the events in your life, or somebody you read or heard that made you on this turn of seeing, whoa, the expectations I had, I can no longer count on. They're not like gravity. I thought they were. Sound is gravity. Perpetual progress here in America. Whoa. So he's getting the stories. And in preparing for this sermon, I had to go back in and look for the concepts and the patterns. But I tell you, I did not have to go back in to search for the stories. There's a couple here that I'm going to point out, just short ones that give examples. Again, these are the stories of how people had their expectations die and have come out on the other side. And post-doom on the other side is not mere acceptance, like in the grief, stages of grief, Kubler-Ross, acceptance. Okay, I accept. No, in this case of eco-grief, civilizational grief, you open that door, the post-doom doorway. You're letting doom go away. It's still there. But you see some light on the other side. As Shaun Chamberlin says, we can still live beautiful lives and make contributions and find joy in the moment and who we associate with. So these are a couple of the stories that really struck me. Richard Heinberg, some of you may be familiar with. He's written a lot afterburn, peak oil, economic collapse, and so forth. He lives in Northern California. He's a baby boomer. And what I found most extraordinary when Michael asked, tell us your story of when you lost this expectation of perpetual progress. And he said, I've been a pessimist since 1972. I was in college and I read Limits to Growth. What amazed me about that short story was you would not guess that about him. You would not guess that he was a pessimist when you see how he presents himself, the musical work he does, as well as all the books he's written. And here's a second thing about his story. The question, well, how did you come through that? Well, as it turns out, he was very much influenced by the Hindu classic story of Arjuna and Krishna and the Bhagavad Gita. And in that story, the essence of it is that even when you're there, as Arjuna was, as a warrior, and going, this is crazy. These people and these people, they have to kill each other, and they're my relatives, they're my friends. Why are we fighting this? And Krishna says, life is a battlefield. This is your role, and do it. And so Richard Heinberg, he's been producing books. He's been trying to help things keep from collapsing as bad as they could, and he's been doing that since 72 in terms of what he sees. So that I find that inspiring. Joanna Macy, wow. Maybe some of you know this story, but I certainly don't. Michael has experienced her a lot, but she says that she first encountered that sort of aha moment, like Limits to Growth, in the 1970s when she took her two kids, to a Jacques Cousteau special exhibit at some place in Boston. And it was about the deterioration of the living world, right? And she said she was stunned. And yet she couldn't speak about it. She couldn't process it for 15 years. Hey, if Joanna Macy couldn't do that, why should I be concerned if I've taken about 3 years to try to move this thing? She had 15. So that was very important. One last one I'll mention is Shaun Chamberlin, the author of that quote on the front of the Order of Service about we can still tell beautiful stories with our lives. I loved his story. He'll be turning 40 this coming year. So he's in that kind of zone of generational times that we don't really have expressed views of what their challenges are or what their expectations might be. And he said, he's a smart guy. He's in the UK, went off to college, looking ahead for making a contribution, kind of being successful like his parents. And one day he receives a note from his dad and says, all right, read this. And it was something about climate in there. Read this. And his dad said, whatever you thought your life was going to be like, it won't. I love you. Bye, Dad. And he said that was it. He did that, and he started exploring that. Okay, so sharing stories is really important and memorable. Some of the people, not all, that Michael interviewed, talked about when you really take this path and you're really shedding expectations, you're making a clearing, what happens, crucially, is an identity shift. Who you are, not just what you're about in the world, but who you are. Some explain it as a sense of expansiveness. I have a sense more of connection to ancestors. Like I mentioned, my Hungarian grandmother, I know she did not have expectations of a brighter future. I know that. And she had a lot of suffering. Her first two children died, and then my mom was born. But this sense of identity for those of us who've been blessed, as I was, born in 1952, had all the expectations of a pretty smart kid coming from a blue-collar, working-class Detroit family, getting out of college with no debt, and then ability to find a career without having to put out 200 resumes, as a lot of kids have to do now. For me, the identity shift has come several times in my life, but the biggest thing is having to find new myths, not just mentors, but new myths to keep me going. And so, as in the bio it mentioned my climate activism, now I'm using my science. I work with moving trees poleward faster than they can move on their own as climate shifts. And so for me, the myth is the man who planted trees. So the opportunity to try to help people who are in this clearing time to have a chance to sample what a myth might be, like Richard Heinberg, the Arjuna Krishna story, powerful for him in his life, could come from any tradition. I'd like to move now into the very last pattern, which is the generational distinctions. Okay, so we've been through the differences of outlook, and yet not debating the science or anything like that anymore. The importance of having people that you can be genuinely in conversation with and feel that you're mirrored back, you're not alone, you're not crazy. Importance of sharing stories. Being open to having an identity shift and maybe searching for a mythic context. I know quite a few of the people that Michael has interviewed thus far, well, where do they get it? Buddhism. You know, life is suffering. Okay, got that. Non-attachment to results. Very easy with that to decide to go into right action without having to have somebody tell you it's actually going to make a difference. So the Buddhist perspective is really used by quite a few people. So is Taoism. Carolyn Baker talked about Jungian psychology, that depth, looking down into the darkness was very helpful for her. One of the youngest ones, even though she grew up in an ashram, this is Ganga Devi Braun, an ashram in Florida. And even though Ram Dass, some of you may know that Ram Dass died recently, she just had a personal audience with Ram Dass just a few months ago. And yet she said, in this interview, she came out of it and she got some wisdom there, but she said, he's not my guru. My guru is Earth. I communicate with Earth all the time. She talks to me. And so there's this Earth sense. Stephen Jenkinson, the grief worker, die wise. He's not indigenous himself, but he draws from the perspectives of the indigenous there where he is in eastern Canada. So there's a lot of things that people draw from for identity and myth. But the fifth one is the generational distinctions. I'd say the main lesson I've learned, I'm so grateful for, is anyone in this room who's as old as I am or older, you know what? We could all instantly fall over and die, and the world would be no worse for these young people. The wisdom they have already gained and are showing. Now, they'll often mention mentors like Joanna Macy, Vandana Shiva, other people they'll mention, but they've got that, and they're now translating it. And so that was really, I could let go of feeling like, how are people going to carry on with wisdom? Well, duh, no problem. I also learned that it's very important, there's a faux pas that we boomers in particular can really do if we're talking with someone who is a much younger generation, okay? Maybe some of you have felt it, maybe not, but I share with another one of the interviews Michael did with Terry Patten, who's just a year older than I am. He co-wrote a book with Ken Wilber. He's part of the integral theory people. And what he said in this interview, he said, I have to give up my sense that my books are any legacy at all. Things have changed so much. And I know I felt that in the 90s. I had 4 books published. I could see some in university libraries all over the place. And I look at it now and I go, I was resting in that as a legacy? Their primary use might be firewood. I mean, gallows humor is important. But for us boomers, that may be an important thing, and there's nothing wrong with our concern for legacy and how do we make a little turn and still have something to become ancestors that our grandchildren could be proud of. What can we do in the few years we have left? But you don't talk about that with young people because they're going to look at you cross-eyed. And they're going to go, you're worrying about your legacy? We're worried about survival. So with that, I'd like to close with the youngest, Ganga Devi Braun, a quotation she gave again. This is just oral, not a written book. But what she said that just so inspirited me, she said, you know, doom is not part of my vernacular when I'm able to step back and look at things through the lens of deep time. Regeneration is my preferred term, as it includes death, decay, and the importance of composting. Simple. So may we all be thinking about and feeling our possibility for truly becoming ancestors that our grandchildren and the grandchildren of others could perhaps be proud of.